All right, let's take a look at something called vestigial characteristics. Vestigial means, or derives from the Latin word vestigium, which means footprint or trace. And these characteristics are generally structures or characteristics that they're there, but they don't have any known function. So then scientists started to ask the question, well, why are these structures there? In general, the general rule of thumb in biology is if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So someone in a wheelchair is not using their legs start to atrophy. The muscle mass and bone mass starts to decrease because you're not using it. Same goes with your skills, by the way, your study skills or your knowledge base. The less you use those functions, the less your brain, the less energy your brain feels it needs to dedicate to keeping up that ability or that function. Any athlete could tell you if they once they stop practicing, then even though they still harbor some basic skill, they're not to the point where they were when they were at their peak. So you start to lose function the less you use it. So vestigial organs are organs or structures or behaviors that don't seem to have a purpose anymore. And they might have a small purpose, but not one that would justify having an entire structure. Something like your tonsils have been argued that are vestigial organs from when our ancestors had larger throats or some other structure that required tonsils. How would we know that? Well, we can look at other organisms and compare structures in them to ourselves and ask, could these structures have existed in some common ancestor that, as we've changed throughout history, the natural history of the world, as mutations accrued, and, for instance, human hominid jaws became smaller. If you ever seen pictures of cavemen, which actually Neanderthal or some other species of human, if you ever saw their jaws are much, much bigger. So our jaws have gotten smaller, and they've needed to become smaller. And if you think about the physics of it and the geometry of it, the jaw had to become smaller so that the skull could become bigger. More room could be made for the brain. Less room was available for the jaw. There are limits to the size of the head, and there are some physical realities to giving birth. So, one good example is our skulls are not fused when we're first born. When we're first born, our skulls are made of small bony plates that are connected, but they float almost. And as our heads grow after we're born, our heads grow so that those bones start to fuse together. You can actually see the lines of that fusion in a skull that's of a mature male or female. So the physical realities here is that this skull needs to fit through its mother's vagina, so the skull is not fused, it's flexible. So baby's skull can move around as it squeezes through the smaller opening. Also, the baby's skull is going to grow, and if you're going to have a bone that's going to grow, the brain has to grow inside it. You have to have space for it to grow out, and so you see the baby's skull is not fused. It's connected, but they're not fused. Once the baby gets to be an adult, those lines are all fused together. You can see the plates here fused in the adult skull, and that goes all the way around. So you need to deal with, if you're going to be developing a human being or any creature, You need to deal with some physical realities. So wisdom teeth is another good example of this geometric shape and size and volume, right? So they only have a certain amount of volume in your mouth, but we have these teeth that don't seem to have purpose. A lot of us have extra teeth. I had to have 4 removed myself, 2 on each side, suggesting that since it happens in so many people, the question is, why do we have these extra teeth that push the other teeth out of the way? They shift the teeth in such a way as to actually make them point outward, and it really seems, and it causes all kinds of problems, dental problems down the line. So why have these teeth growing in places that don't seem to have any purpose? Well, if we take a look at some of our common ancestors, we see the reality that their jaws are much bigger in proportion to their skulls. Their face and eye sockets, eyebrow ridges, their jaws are bigger. Their teeth take up a bigger proportion of their skull. Where humans, our brain cavity takes up more of our space. We have evolved larger brains, and something had to give. That thing that gave was the size of the jaw. The jaw actually became smaller. If we look at our ancestors are more closely related to us, you'll see that they still had larger jaws. And since they had larger jaws in comparison to our brain cavity, they had more space for those teeth. Those number of teeth, in fact, are very similar to the number of teeth we have today, but the jaw size is smaller. So something had to give. The thing that gave is that the jaw became smaller, fine, but the gene for how many teeth we have is still there, and we're still producing the same number of teeth with a smaller jaw. So we have these extra teeth called wisdom teeth that that a lot of us, not all of us, have to have removed. So we would call these wisdom teeth vestigial, right? They're a footprint or a trace, a clue, if you will, to our ancestry, to our common ancestors. There's a lot of these clues. Here's some others. We have the palmaris longus. It's a muscle that runs down the wrist to the elbow. It doesn't really have a purpose. It doesn't really do much. And if you do a specific movement, you might see it. And about 16% of us don't even have it. And we live our lives fine. Those 16% then would have the mutation that got rid of that muscle. That is, in essence, evolution in the middle of in the process of getting rid of a structure that is not necessary any longer. Obviously, or what scientists think anyways, is that at some point while we were living in a different environment, perhaps trees, perhaps somewhere else where a specific motion was necessary, that muscle might have been important for the survival. Might have given one of our ancestors an advantage. It doesn't give us an advantage today in our environment as we walk on 2 legs and use tools. Goosebumps. You know how your hair stands up on end when there's a cold breeze or when you feel something creepy is going on, or for any number of reasons. There are these pili muscles, tiny little muscles on your hair follicles that lift up. My dog, especially my male dog, but both my dogs, when they get riled up, their pili muscles contract, and their hair on their back, people would say the hair on the back of your neck, literally stands up. It looks like a hyena, like a porcupine lifting their quills. And in fact, that was probably the original function of our pili muscles, the things that give us goosebumps. We were probably a lot hairier, and when those little muscles lifted up, we became just like my dogs. When they become riled up, they look meaner, they look tougher. Maybe they increase warmth, right? Because the hair is all out, and it makes it fluffier, which improves the how well the hair insulates them. And cats do the same thing. You'll see cats when they get all upset, they'll get all fuzzy. Their hair goes up and stands up on end. Again, two different functions. They they get to look bigger and scarier, and they get to be warmer. Now, this muscle does neither of those functions in us. We're not hairy enough for it to help insulate us. Even the hairiest of us isn't as hairy as a dog or a cat. And they really don't help us look any tougher or bigger. So why are the goosebumps? Why are those muscles still? Why are they here? Why are they on our bodies? Again, it's a clue. Scientists are pretty sure it's a clue or footprint as to our evolutionary past. The arcular muscles are a set of muscles that we don't need as well. They're part of the visible ear, and they take control of visible ear. Some people can even move their ears a little bit because of these muscles. Now, with dogs, as you know, or cats, or any animal that moves their ears, they can move their ears to better help them hear. My cats can turn their ears all the way around and face behind them so they can hear what's happening behind them. We can't do that. These muscles don't function that way in us anymore. Which again begs the question: why do we have a muscle that at best allows us to flinch our ears? Why is that muscle even there? So the answer to the question, again, considering it a footprint, trace, or clue as to our past, is that it's a vestigial organ. It's an organ that's left over from evolution. As our ears became smaller, we became to depend on sight, and even though our hearing is good, it's not as important when we started to dedicate brain space to various sensory organs. We've dedicated a lot of space to smelling and sight, and less of that to hearing. So our ears no longer, and also the changes in our skull, the changes in our overall physique and how we do things, hearing became less important, and so the ability to twist our ears around started to become less and less important out to today, where it's not really that important to be able to twist our ears backwards. So this muscle, again, is considered a vestigial organ. The pyramidal muscle, pyramidal, let's go with that, is in the lower abdomen. It's shaped like a triangle, and unless you've had an MRI, you probably don't even know you have one, and it doesn't really do anything. So again, another muscle that's left over that you can find in other creatures. All these things you can find in other creatures that have function in other creatures because of how they walk or what they do. If they swing on trees, or if they walk on all fours, or if they have hair all over themselves. All these things, they have an obvious function in their bodies, but these muscles don't have a function in ours. Human embryos between 5 and 8 weeks develop a tail, and before the baby's born, most babies are born without tails. The tail is reabsorbed, and the lowest part of the vertebra they fuse into what a lot of people call tailbone or coccyx. Uh, some babies are born with a tail, small and maneuverable. Some people can actually even wag them. They wag. They actually have muscles around them. But most people choose to have the tailbone removed. So even though they or the tail removed, so even though they had a tail, the tail's removed because again, it doesn't have a function in humans. So much so that humans actually have evolved to reabsorb it and fuse the bones for the most part. So another one of those transitional genes that are slowly leaving the population, and who knows what we will look like in a couple thousand years, if that is selected for or not, and will it change in the population? Will that frequency change in the population? Perhaps the other way, it'll go the other way. Perhaps tails will start becoming more important to us, and 10,000, 100,000 years, if we're still around, maybe we'll have tails again. That can happen as the environment changes, as things become either more or less advantageous. The structure can increase, the genes can increase or decrease in frequency in our population. The plica semilunaris, again, these words, pronunciation, forgive me, I'm probably slaughtering them. It's a third eyelid. It's a fold of tissue that's in the corner of our eye that in cats, for instance, you can actually watch them. If you ever watch cats, you'll see that third eyelid kind of squeeze on by and almost like a wiper wipe off the outer part of the eye. It helps lubricate the eye, helps protect them against any damage. Dogs have this third eyelid as well. We don't have a third eyelid. We only have two, the upper and the lower. This third eyelid, though, the folds, the tissue for the third eyelid is still there. You can see it in the corner of your eye if you look closely in the mirror. It has no function in us. But it does have a function in other species that are related to us. The tonsils and your appendix, as I mentioned tonsils earlier, they're often removed in us. Now, some people argue that tonsils and the appendix have an immune system link, that they might help us keep bacteria and introduce our immune system to bacteria, to foreign bodies. That may be the case, but that function is certainly not not a main function. It's not a function that would justify having an organ. However, if you look at other organisms, you might find parallels in structures that have different functions that we no longer need because we evolved something else, or our environment changed, or our behavior changed that made it unnecessary. So it became less important, and as natural selection went about its business, selecting the best fit to survive, those that had an appendix weren't necessarily chosen. Those that had the larger version of the appendix, or the larger version of the tonsils, were no longer had an advantage. Those that had a smaller version, less functional one, had an advantage. Maybe more room in the throat for the tonsils, maybe more room for larger intestine in the abdomen, which allowed them to absorb food better. Maybe that gave them an advantage over those that had larger, whatever the appendix is in our common ancestor, or a larger, whatever the tonsils are in our common ancestor. Having the wider throat, more room in the throat, having more room for intestine or colon, gave our ancestors an advantage, and so our tonsils ended up being smaller, our appendix smaller, and its function became less important. The sinuses. I know a lot of you have had sinus headaches or stuffy noses. Those are those are inflammations, probably bacterial infections, maybe viral, of just empty spaces right around your nose, around both sides of your nose, and right above your nose. They're just empty spaces. They have no real function whatsoever. They help resonate the voice a little bit, but other than that, there really is no reason to have these. In fact, one might even say it's detrimental to us because they're really the perfect example of a space that's wet, dark, moist, or I should say moist, and dark, ready for and open to bacterial infection. They're just collecting places for bacteria. So why would we have them? Well, we wouldn't with our present skull structure, right? Presently, if you look at a skull, there's no reason to have empty spaces here along this side and along this side. Why have these empty spaces? You might say draining or something, but they don't drain anything. They're just empty. They wouldn't need draining if they were solid. So they're probably left over from some previous ancestor. Something was connected to it. The skull had a different shape, or the skull had a different structure there. Whatever the case is, those sinuses are left over. They give us no real advantage or disadvantage, so they just stay. And that's the key: is that if a structure doesn't really give you a disadvantage, then the gene is not selected against. So there's no natural selection against it, so there's no reason that there would be a change in the gene frequency in a population. The only time there's a gene frequency change is either genetic drift, which is a random event that takes out a specific subset of genes, or it's selected against. Something makes you less fit to survive in a particular environment. And we'll talk more about those mechanisms in the next part of this unit. So when we talk about these structures, we talk about them as vestigial. Now, do vestigial organs or structures exist in other organisms? Certainly they do. And the best example that I think it's the coolest example anyways, is a whale. We can actually identify a pelvis in a whale, a femur, and other parts of the lower legs, lower forelimb in a whale. Now you see in a whale has the five. It's pentadactyl, has 5 fingers, has the metacarpals, has the phalanges, has a scapula, has a femur, has all the upper arm and the upper arm bone, the 2 lower arm bones, the wrist bones. So all that's there in a whale. A whale. It's astounding to me. But its lower limbs, right? Its hind limbs are very small. The bones are there though. You can identify the bones. Now, why would there be lower limb bones that have absolutely no function in a whale? What happened to a whale that it had lower limb bones, but now it doesn't any longer? There are the bones here, and you can identify them. They have the pelvis and the femur, etc. But they have no function, very much like all the muscles we just discussed in humans, and the appendix and the tonsils, etc. But here we have a whale. Well, we can look at other anatomical and structural and look at the fossil records and look at an organism called the Pachytus, again the Pachytus, I guess Pachytus, in early Eocene, and you can see it had 4 legs. It had the hind limbs. And then you have the Pachytus was very much related to a hippopotamus, right? They're very similar. Hippopotamus and whales have a common ancestor. And so the whale was actually a land mammal that started to go further and further out into the ocean to get food. As it did, it became an advantage to do so. So they were able to eat better, and or probably maybe there were less predators, but certainly there was more space and then more food. They were able to again come back onto land, and so that gave them an advantage. But soon the whales lost those hind limbs theoretically, so they can keep swimming further and further out. And ultimately, you have our modern whales that can now take advantage of all kinds of things. Different kinds of whales have filled in different niches, as you had radiating adaptation, right? Adaptive radiation, rather, where you had each different population filling in an empty niche in the ocean. You have something like this baleen whale that's going to filter out the tiny krill, the tiny little organisms that are swimming in the ocean, taking advantage of all the krill that's out there. Where a shark isn't going to eat them because they're too tiny, the giant whale can scoop them up by the tons and grow incredibly large and be very happy. But it no longer needs the hind legs. So this is fossil evidence that shows us, and we have a lot of transition fossils, so you can see the changes. You can see the bones fusing, the bones extend, the tailbone extending, the muscle groups changing. Well, not muscle groups, since we don't really have fossils of a lot of muscles, but you can see a lot of these. You can, first of all, as far as muscles go and outer skin, we really can't tell outer skin color in a fossil. Color is not something that can be fossilized. But the muscles and the width can be estimated by the size of the bone. If you question about how, watch a show called Bones on television, which is obviously a dramatization, but they take some real life science and make it and use it obviously way too easily, and it's all exaggerated. However, there are a number of positions where people take skulls that they find, they estimate based on formulas the scientists have calculated. If you have a bone this size, you must have muscles this size and a tendon this long, and that would mean that you probably have this much muscle mass around this particular bone, etc., and do that for the entire beast. Then you can come up with this a thickness, muscle shape, and a size of the creature. We do that with human skulls, and we can actually predict what to some degree, with some degree of error, predict what the individual look like based on the skull size, shape. Some people like to think that they can determine Caucasian or subgroup or population, whether the individual had dark skin or light skin. I would argue there's probably a lot more error in that than people would like to admit. However, it's an interesting pursuit, and I'm not familiar enough with it to really comment on any percentages. However, since it's just a really good use of this technique of looking at bones and then coming up with some kind of estimated shape, or what did the organism look like based on the bones. Paleontologists have been doing this for longer than anyone, but today we're using it in forensic science to, when someone finds bones of humans, you can predict what that person looked like, at least with some limitations, but at least it's a good guess. Sort of like an eyewitness drawing of someone's face. All right, so let's look at these questions. Okay, the first question asks how natural selection, in terms of natural selection, explain how structures that were once useful in an organism could become vestigial. So again, and I think I've said it before, but the whale is a perfect example. I almost don't want to say it, but consider this, just to kind of try to put it in context for you. Here's this organism that while it lived on land, the four limbs were necessary. The hind limbs were probably getting smaller than its ancestors because it wasn't using them as much in the water. But as somewhere in between it and the next step in their evolution, whale evolution, there's some creature, some mutation that possibly had webbed toes that gave it an advantage, so it had more babies. So natural selection selected the creature with webbed toes. Then that creature had a baby, perhaps that the toes became more of a flipper, and that baby became more. It was more advantageous for that baby to swim in the ocean, so that these not only did there was their webbing in between, but they actually became flippers. And then the tailbone, then the bones of, the tailbone extended and had little rudder-like extensions that allowed this creature to swim even better. So again, making analogous to human, we have the gene for a tail. We know that because some babies are born with small stubby tails. Imagine if doctors weren't removing it and it somehow started to become an advantage. Two people with tails had babies, and those two people, their babies had longer tails, and somehow that tail became an advantage in swimming, i.e. here with the whales, and those tails became, as you can see, its ancestor had a tail, but maybe this next step in evolution just had the extensions. But whatever the change is, as the environment changed, the population was big enough, there was enough genetic variation and phenotypic variation that natural selection could select the ones that had tails and no hind limbs, and those creatures could swim further, capture better prey, and therefore they got bigger. There was again this adaptive radiation as these organisms found niches that were not being taken advantage of. They had plenty of food, few predators, so they had a lot of their children surviving with a lot of different genetic mutations and structural changes, which allowed for the best swimmer, the best whatever, to continue to increase in number. So the genes of that for those particular traits increase in number. But the genes for the hind limbs become less and less necessary, but they were not selected against. So vestigial structures, the key to vestigial structures is they have no advantage, but they also don't have a disadvantage. If they have a disadvantage, theoretically over time, their frequency, their gene frequency would decrease. If there's no advantage at all, and no disadvantage, then it's a neutral trait or neutral gene. The only thing that impacts a neutral gene is genetic drift, right? Some random event taking it out. In the case of something like the extra molars, that could probably be a disadvantage over time, and perhaps if we didn't have dentists, perhaps they would disappear out of the population. As those of us with extra teeth started having more cavities, more infections, and died earlier, therefore those people with less teeth would become a larger portion of our population. So consider the idea of natural selection and how structures occur, how vestigial structures occur. They're generally structures that don't have an advantage or disadvantage, or if they have an advantage or disadvantage, it's a small one. So they're not really selected against in the population. So, and by the way, if you take a look at these two other examples besides the whale, in a snake, all snakes have an extra lobe to a lung that they really can't use because their bodies are they're much more tubular than their ancestors' bodies. And they actually have pelvic girdles, like the whale has a pelvic girdle. Remember, the pelvis is used to walk, for the hind limbs. Why would a snake need a pelvic girdle for walking if it doesn't have legs? It has the bones; they're not useful. It has an extra lung lobe, but it's not useful because it can't be used. The body doesn't fit the body. These aren't mistakes; they are left over as the individual, as its common ancestor, lost the ability to develop to walk, as those that could slither, could use their muscles and vertebra in different ways, had an advantage over those that could scurry around the ground. The same with the kiwi. It's a bird. It had wings. And in fact, it still has wings. They're tiny. They're not useful at all. They don't even flutter very much, if at all. They're tiny little things. If you looked at them, you probably couldn't even identify the wings. But they have the bones for them. Well, they developed, again, their ancestors didn't need wings, and something made them actually something else more advantageous. Something else was more advantageous than having wings. So slowly, those that had that something else, I don't know what it is, became more prevalent in the population because natural selection selected it. Those that didn't have the wings and had that other thing, whatever it is, more muscle in the leg, more leg muscle or what have you, had an advantage in their environment. The same with the snakes. They had four legs, but at some point, being able to slither around and swallow its prey became more important than having an extra lobe to the lung or having those extra legs. So those that didn't have the legs and had more muscle and could slither better had an advantage. They had more babies, and they became the dominant form that you find in the population. You can look at the same thing happening in humans as our skulls became bigger, as our brain cavities became bigger, our jaws became smaller, and the wisdom teeth became less important. In fact, they're useless. So these vestigial organs, now, for the most part, they don't cause trouble. They could cause increased tooth decay, and perhaps without dentists, there would be issues. But in any case, they're not. They do. People with wisdom teeth are able to marry and have babies, as many as those that without. So there really is no change in the population, in the frequency of wisdom teeth in the population. So these are vestigial. Same with the bones in the back of the whale. These don't harm the whale. They don't help the whale. So the whales continue to have these bones. These little vestigial wings, tiny little wings, don't hurt the kiwi. They don't help the kiwi. So the kiwi, all their babies still have those genes. There's no reason they would leave the population. Same with the snake that has the small pelvic bone and the extra lobe to the lung really has no advantage, but there's no disadvantage to it either. So those structures stay in the population, left over from a previous environment where they were useful. Now they're no longer useful. So transitional fossils are transitional forms, right? Are those fossils that we find that are in between. The example is the winged dinosaurs, right? So here's a winged dinosaur fossil, a fossil where you can see the wings. It's an impression, obviously, the feathers. You can see feathers. They have wings. They have the structures are very similar to bird bones. They're not quite bird bones, right? They do have feathers. They have similar shapes to birds' wings. They have teeth, though. Birds don't have teeth. They have other things that other structures that are more correlated with the lizard. So here's this fossil that's part lizard and part bird. So this is what we would call a transitional fossil. It's a form that's in between the lizard form of the dinosaur and the bird form of the dinosaur. And this one's in between. So that would be an example. This actually came to the attention of Darwin and of the person who coined the name dinosaur. So they actually were these fossils were found about that time. So when we look at these transitional fossils, when we look at them, we have to consider how do vestigial organs help us identify, right, these connections between species, the ancestry, right? How does that happen? When we look at the whale, when we look at a whale and we identify structures in these transitional fossils to a whale, we can look at this creature and see similarities between it, perhaps how many toes, or the shapes of the toes, or the thickness of the bone, or the size of the skull, or the breaks in the skull, or the fusion lines in the skull, or the size the comparison of the size of the eye to the nostrils, or what have you. I'm not sure what those would be, but whatever connections they have, this transition fossil has to both its common the thing to both the whale and, let's say, the hippopotamus. What kinds of connections can be found between those two? So vestigial structures help us because this is a clue that this organism, this whale, was a land-walking mammal. The vestigial wing in a kiwi is a clue that this kiwi is related to a flying bird. And this snake is somehow related to a reptile that used to have 4 legs, because we know it has a pelvis and an extra lobe to a lung, both of which can be found in earlier forms of lizards that were long and had the similar shape of the head, but had 4 legs, or had the a functional extra lobe. So these vestigial organs help us identify what creature this kiwi, this snake, or this whale was most closely related to by comparing the vestigial organ to that creature. Just as these extra teeth in humans, when we look to see what humans might be related to, we can go look and see how many teeth do the other primates have, how big are their jaws, and we can see that the smaller jaw, that these extra teeth had something to do, had some kind of relationship between humans and that other organism. So by looking at commonalities and differences between the vestigial and looking at vestigial organs as the footprint or clue that links us to our evolutionary past, we're able to compare species and say, well, a whale is more closely related to a hippopotamus than it is a horse or a cow. But a whale is related to both hippopotamus and cow. It just depends on how far back you want to go in the evolution, in the phylogenetic tree, in its ancestral tree. We have fossils of all these creatures, and you can see how they've changed over time, how these creatures, how they're linked. We can compare all these points of comparison. Look at them. All these different points of comparison. We can look at these traits and see where all these traits were found throughout the whale's ancestral history, and then we find all those traits here in the whale. The hippopotamus evolved a long time ago from a common ancestor that whales shared here, and they pretty much they stayed the way they are. They kept all four of their limbs. They didn't go back into the ocean as far as the whale did. They certainly spent a lot of time in the water, and they've evolved. They have a lot of characteristics that allow them to be in the water. They have a tail that they use actually as a little bit of a balance in the water. They swim through the water and actually run at the bottom of the lake bed as well. But they can swim. Their nostrils are at the top as they float. They can use their nostrils can open and close, allow them to breathe, very much like the whale does, with its blowhole at the top. The cow is obviously a complete land animal, longer legs. The key to the connecting there to the shape and the number of toes that are fused on their feet. That is one of the characteristics that links all these two together. And you can see that there's all these points of comparison between the ancestor of the whale and these three existent animals today, the cow, the whale, and the hippopotamus. You can see connections between them and their common ancestors because, in part, of these vestigial organs that help us give us a clue that the whale actually was a land-walking animal at some point. Otherwise, how would you explain it having a femur and a pelvis? The same that the snake was a land-walking organism at one point, because how else would you explain that it has a pelvis and an extra lobe? The kiwi was some type of flight of bird that flew through the air. But over time, its ancestors spent more its ancestors that had smaller wings and more leg muscle or what have you were selected for, and those that had the wings and smaller leg muscles were selected against. These that didn't have wings had more babies, and now that's all the genes that you have in that population. Same with whales. Now they're all true breeding. Now whales are born without back legs. They just have these little bony leftovers. All right. So I hope that helps you answer these questions in your own words. All right. Good luck.